Hi, this is Grandma Lorie, and today the story of David, Bathsheba, and the Wars of David. So, now King Saul was dead. David had long ago been anointed by the prophet Samuel to be the next king after Saul. But Saul had one living son named Ishbosheth. Many important Israelites supported Ishbosheth to be the next king, but many more wanted David. This caused a civil war for many months while Israelites fought and died for their choice of king. Then, two men who thought they were doing a big favor for King David snuck into the house of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul. While he was sleeping, they stabbed him and cut off his head. They brought the head as a gift to David. They thought David would praise them and give them a big reward of money. But David was horrified. He had promised Saul that he would never harm Saul's children and grandchildren. These two men had broken David's promise and killed a good and innocent man. So David ordered his soldiers to kill those men, and that caused even more battles. Now, if you like to read bloody war stories, that's what the book of 2 Samuel is mostly about. But some other important things happened in between those battles. First, in chapter 5, after Ishbosheth was dead, all of the elders of Israel gathered together and voted to make David their one and only king. He was only age 30, but David was a good king. He reigned for 40 years with justice over all of Israel and was fair to everyone. He never favored one man over another just because he liked them, and he always asked the Lord for advice about fighting his battles against their wicked, idol-worshiping enemies. Time after time, the Lord guided David's armies to victory. David ruled well and fought at the front of all Israel's battles during his prime years. A second important thing was that David and his armies conquered the main city of the Jebusites. It was a fortress high on a hill. When David won, David took over that city to be his own governing place. He gave the city two names. He said, "We shall now name this place the City of David, because I am its king. We will also call it Jerusalem, which means the city of peace. From now on, I will make Jerusalem my capital city." And you know that Jerusalem has been the capital city of Israel for thousands of years, up to this very day. I must change the subject for a moment to tell you about one unusual thing that all kings did in those days to keep peace in their lands. Kings took wives and concubines from different places in their land. Smart kings figured out that if one of their wives was from a certain strong city, that city would never rebel against the husband of their princess. And it worked. So all kings in those days married many women, and so did David. He had 9 official wives and several more concubines. A concubine is sort of a halfway wife who doesn't get as much honor. Unfortunately, David had to fight more and more and more wars with wicked nations around Israel for many years. It took time for David's army to slowly take over the whole land that God had given to Israel in the days of Abraham. Finally, after many years of war, the land had peace from all its enemies. And then a third thing happened in the middle of these wars that would make a difference in the kingdom of Israel forever. This is the story. There was one time when David did not go with his armies to fight against the Ammonites. He had always gone with his men and fought with his men before, but this time David stayed home. That evening, David just couldn't sleep. It was too hot, and he was worried about how the battles and other problems of his kingdom were going. So he got up from his bed and wandered around to a balcony in his palace. From there, he could look down over the entire city. Because his palace was so high in the hills of Jerusalem, all the other houses were below him. David could see easily down onto the rooftops and into the courtyards of other homes around his palace. It was common with all the people in Jerusalem that when it was too hot in the city, people would go up to their flat rooftops to eat and sleep out and do almost anything up there where it was cooler in the evenings. Near David's palace was the home of one of David's highest generals, named Uriah. David could see right down into Uriah's courtyard. It was a large private patio surrounded by other parts of the house. It happened that on that night, Uriah's young and beautiful wife stood in that courtyard taking a bath. They didn't have bathtubs, just large open pots of water with dippers to scoop out and pour water over themselves, and lots of washcloths to rub over all and rinse off. The young wife was named Bathsheba. When David saw her, he should have turned away. But she was so gorgeous, he could not take his eyes off her the whole time she was bathing. And after she dried off and went into her house, David could not stop thinking about her. His heart beat as hard as if he'd never felt passion before. He had to meet her. He knew he should not have anything to do with her. She was married, but he was overwhelmed by his feelings. David sent a servant to her house to ask the woman to come right away because the king wanted to talk with her. Well, when the king asks you to come for a visit, you don't have a choice. You must come. They had never met before, but Bathsheba had seen the king on his balcony many times, as well as in the king's parades through the city whenever his army won a battle. She thought the king was very handsome. He was strong and powerful. He was kind and just and loved the Lord. Bathsheba's husband had praised David's wonderful personality whenever he came home from his wars. But her husband Uriah hardly ever came home. He loved being out, leading his army from city to city and battle to battle. So, how did Uriah end up with such a young and beautiful wife? It was a custom in Bible times that the father of a girl would choose a good husband from the men he knew and give his daughter to that man. Often, the girl barely knew the man she would marry. Bathsheba had been given to Uriah as his wife by her father. Uriah was very nice, but much older than his young bride, and frankly, not much company even when he was home. So Bathsheba was excited when the king asked her to visit him. But it did seem very strange to be invited to the palace all alone and rather late in the evening. Bathsheba was led to the king's personal rooms, which included the one with the balcony. King David served her wine and delicious little rolls his cooks had made. He just wanted to talk to her alone, he said. They talked and laughed and had a really good time together. David even played his harp and sang for her. His singing melted Bathsheba's heart. It didn't take long for Bathsheba to feel very, very attracted to this handsome king. And this king was already enraptured by the beautiful Bathsheba. Somehow, with the wine and the music, they ended up kissing and then hugging for a long time. After that evening, both of them felt guilty. They knew they absolutely must not meet each other again, but both of them felt very much in love and very torn up with guilt as well. They had broken the seventh commandment of God by hugging and kissing too much with someone they weren't married to. That was called adultery, and it was a very serious sin. They both knew it. Inside, they both felt miserable. A few weeks later, Bathsheba discovered she was going to have a baby. Her husband Uriah had not been home for half a year, so she knew who the father of the baby had to be: David, the king. What on earth should she do? You see, the law of Moses says that if a person commits the sin of adultery, he or she must be stoned to death by all the people in the community. That's where people throw big rocks at a lawbreaker until the rocks kill them. Of course, nobody would stone the king if they found out, but they would certainly stone Bathsheba to death, and she was terrified. So she sent a note to King David telling him she was pregnant with a child and begging to know what she should do. David did not want Bathsheba to be killed by stoning. So he thought and came up with a plan. He would ask Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, to come home to report on the war. While he was home, Uriah would surely sleep with his wife, Bathsheba, and everyone would think the baby that was born later was Uriah's child. David sent his orders, and Uriah came home with a dozen of his officers to report their battles to King David. Then King David sent Uriah home to his wife. But Uriah did not go home. He thought it wouldn't be fair for him to go home to the comforts of a wife when his officers had to stay home and sleep in a field to guard the Ark of the Covenant. So Uriah slept in the field with his officers. When David found that out, he was desperate. He invited Uriah to dinner that evening and got him drunk on wine. David said, "Now go home, Uriah, and bring comfort to your wife. She hasn't seen you for months." But again, Uriah did not go home. He slept at the main door of the palace to guard the king. The next day, Uriah and his officers got ready to go back to the battlefield. What on earth could David do? He had never been so panic-stricken in his life, knowing how he had broken the Lord's commandment and might bring Bathsheba to her death. Finally, David wrote a letter to his head general, Joab, who was in charge of Uriah. He sealed it up and told Uriah to take the letter to Joab. Joab read the letter with surprise, but didn't tell anyone what it said. The letter said to send Uriah to the most dangerous battlefront, where he was almost certain to be killed by their enemies. In a few days, the news came back to Jerusalem that Uriah had gone bravely into battle, right up to the walls of the enemy's city. Archers on top of the walls of the city shot arrows down on Uriah and his men and killed them. David did not feel relieved, even though his plan worked. He felt worse than ever. He had not shot the arrows from the wall that killed Bathsheba's husband, but he had intended for Uriah to die. He knew it was about the same thing as murder. Even if nobody knew, he made it happen. But he could never allow Bathsheba to be stoned to death for his own sin. When Bathsheba heard that her husband was dead, she grieved and mourned. Now she was all alone. She too felt more guilty than ever. Uriah had been kind and generous, even if she hardly ever saw him. It was the law of Moses that a widow had to weep and cry for 7 days, dressed in a gown of itchy sackcloth and with ashes sprinkled on her head. When the week of mourning was over, David sent for Bathsheba and married her. He did love her truly, and she did love David truly. But what about their sin together? The Lord was not pleased with David or Bathsheba. The Lord told his prophet, Nathan, what David and Bathsheba had done, and he told Nathan to go to David with a story for King David to judge. David was a wonderful judge. Prophet Nathan came to David and said, Your Majesty, I have a serious case to put before you for judgment. Then Nathan began this story. There were 2 men in a certain city, one very rich, owning many flocks of sheep and herds of goats, and the other was very poor, owning nothing but one little lamb he had managed to buy. It was his children's pet, and he fed it from his own plate and let it drink from his own cup. He cuddled it in his arms like a baby daughter. Everyone in the throne room was listening to the story. The prophet Nathan continued. Then one day the rich man had a friend who came for dinner. Instead of killing a lamb from his own flocks for food to feed his guest, he took away the poor man's little lamb, killed it, roasted it, and served it to his guest. Now, King David, I ask you, what is your judgment in this case? David was furious. I swear by the living God that any man who would do such a thing as that should be put to death. At least he shall repay 4 lambs to the poor man for the one he stole and for having no pity. Prophet Nathan stood up straight, looked David in the eyes and said, You are that rich man. The Lord God of Israel says to you, I made you king of Israel and saved you from the power of Saul. I gave you his palace and his goods and the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. If that had not been enough, I would have given you much more. Why then have you despised my laws and done this horrible deed? For you have murdered Uriah and stolen his wife. Therefore, murder shall be a constant threat in your family from this time on, because you have insulted your God by taking Uriah's wife. Your God says to you, David, I vow that because of what you have done, I will cause your own household to rebel against you. You did this in secret, but I will punish you openly in the sight of all Israel. David began to weep. In truth, I have sinned against the Lord. Nathan replied, Yes, you have, but the Lord has forgiven you just enough that you won't die for this sin. Instead, your child will die when it is born. Prophet Nathan returned home, but David and Bathsheba watched with worry as their child grew in her womb. When the baby was born, it was a perfect boy. Both David and Bathsheba prayed and fasted for days, begging the Lord to let their child live. But on the 7th day, the child died. Upon its death, David went to the holy tabernacle to weep in grief before God. There is a story that says that David was willing to die for what he had done. So in this story, he laid his hand on the holy ark, expecting to die, as the priest did, who steadied the ark on a bumpy road. But this story goes on. God let David live So David knew the Lord had forgiven him through his true repentance. David tried to comfort Bathsheba, who wept pitifully. Oh, David, I never had a child with Uriah. And because you and I sinned, maybe the Lord will never let us have a child. Maybe my life will forever be empty. But David and Bathsheba loved each other, and Bathsheba became pregnant again. When a baby boy was born, Bathsheba named him Solomon, which means peace. And Solomon would grow up to be Israel's greatest king of peace. But for King David, there was very little peace from then on. His sons and his friends fought each other in anger and to get power. Many of them were deeply sinful toward each other, even killing their own brothers and abusing their sisters. Life for King David was just as the prophet Nathan had vowed. Murder was a constant threat in David's family. The rest of David's life was one tragedy after another. But the kingdom of Israel was finally safe from the enemy kingdoms. All of those close by had all been defeated. If you want to read the rest of the wicked deeds, murders, and wars, you will have to read the book of 2 Samuel for yourself. I don't want to tell such awful stories. That's all for today. I'll see you again for another story.